I was born in Andalusia, Spain. A time when the world was on the cusp of change, but still holding on to the old ways. My birth came into a world steeped in tradition yet whispering the winds of modernity. I was the third child in our family, a family with a unique blend of cultures that shaped not only my life but the lives of my siblings and the generations that came after us. My father, Johann, was Swedish, a tall, stoic man with a quiet strength about him. His eyes were the color of the Baltic Sea, a piercing blue that could be both warm and intimidating, depending on his mood. He had left Sweden as a young man, determined to make a name for himself in the wider world. His business acumen was sharp, even in his early 20s, and Spain, with its bustling ports and vibrant trade, seemed like the perfect place for a man with ambition. It was in Spain that he met my mother, Isabel, a woman who was his opposite in almost every way. Isabel, my mother, was a fiery Spanish woman from a wealthy family in Andalusia. Her dark hair and olive skin were a stark contrast to my father's pale features, and her passionate nature balanced his calm demeanor. She was the heart of our home, always full of energy, laughter, and love. Where my father brought discipline and structure, my mother brought warmth and life. Together, they created a household where the contrasts of their cultures blended into something beautiful. Their love story was one of destiny, they often said. My mother had grown up in the sun-drenched hills of southern Spain, surrounded by vineyards and olive groves. She had always been strong-willed and independent, qualities that drew my father to her instantly when they first met at a grand ball in Madrid. He was captivated by her fiery spirit, and she, in turn, was intrigued by his mysterious, quiet nature. It was a romance that defied convention. As my father was a foreigner in a land that still held on to its own traditions tightly. But their love transcended those barriers, and soon they were married, uniting two very different worlds. Together, they had 5 children, but only 4 of us survived past infancy, 3 girls and 1 boy. My oldest sister, Clara, was the firstborn. Clara was the epitome of grace and elegance. Even from a young age, she had a maturity and sense of responsibility that made her the perfect eldest sibling. She was always the one to help my mother around the house, organizing meals, making sure we did our lessons, and overseeing the servants with an authority far beyond her years. Her poised demeanor made her someone everyone admired, and I remember looking up to her with great respect. My younger sister, Sophia, was the dreamer. Where Clara was practical and grounded, Sophia lived in a world of imagination and wonder. She would spend hours in the garden, reading books or sketching flowers, often lost in her own thoughts. She had an insatiable curiosity about the world, constantly asking questions and seeking knowledge in places where others didn't think to look. Her gentle, inquisitive nature made her endearing, and though she was often quiet, her presence in our family was deeply felt. Then there was Andreas, my brother. The only boy among us, Andreas was adventurous, mischievous, and full of life. He was always getting into some sort of trouble. Whether it was sneaking out at night to explore the nearby town or challenging the local boys to races and dares. Despite his rebellious nature, Andreas had a charm that made it impossible to stay mad at him for long. He could talk his way out of any situation, and his infectious smile had a way of melting even the sternest faces. I was the third born, wedged between my elder sister Clara and my younger siblings. I was always observant, learning from both the older and the younger, trying to carve out my place in this family of vibrant personalities. My early years were spent in the large house we called home, a grand estate on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by rolling hills and acres of farmland. The house itself was a masterpiece of architecture, tall, whitewashed walls with arches that let in the golden Spanish sunlight, and gardens that stretched far into the distance, filled with roses, lavender, and olive trees. Our home was a reflection of our family's wealth and status. My father had built a successful business importing luxury goods from across Europe and Asia. He was well respected in the business community, known for his integrity and keen sense of opportunity. People came to him for advice, and he was often away on business trips to Paris, London, and even as far as the Far East. When he returned from his travels, he would bring with him gifts, beautiful silks, intricately carved wooden toys, and exotic spices that filled our home with unfamiliar and exciting scents. But more than that, he would bring back stories. I remember sitting by the fire with my siblings, listening as my father told us tales of bustling markets in Morocco, snow-covered streets in Stockholm, and the mysterious temples of India. Despite his success and the money that came with it, my father was a humble man. He believed that wealth was not something to flaunt but something to be used wisely. He always taught us the value of hard work and the importance of giving back. Money is a tool, he would say. But it's your character that defines who you are. He made sure we understood that the comforts we enjoyed were a result of his labor, and that we should never take them for granted. My mother, on the other hand, believed that life should be celebrated. She was always hosting lavish dinner parties, inviting friends, family, and business associates to our home. The evenings were filled with music, dancing, and laughter. My mother's Spanish heritage came alive during these gatherings, as she would entertain guests with stories from her childhood or perform traditional flamenco dances. Her skirts swirling as she moved with the grace of a seasoned dancer. She had an energy that was contagious, and our home was always filled with joy when she was around. But my mother was more than just a hostess. She had a deep compassion for those less fortunate, and she often involved us in her charitable work. I remember helping her prepare food for the local orphanage or assisting her in organizing fundraisers for the nearby hospital. She wanted us to understand that, while we were privileged, there were many people who were not, and it was our duty to help where we could. Her kindness and generosity left a lasting impression on me, and I've carried those values with me throughout my life. Our childhood was one of privilege, but also one of learning and growth. We had the best education money could buy, attending private schools where we were taught not only academics but also the arts and languages. I remember my tutor, an elderly gentleman from France, who taught us to appreciate literature, poetry, and music. We learned to speak French, English, and Italian, in addition to our native Spanish and the bits of Swedish that my father would occasionally slip into conversation. But it wasn't all lessons and formalities. We spent hours exploring the vast estate, running through the fields and playing games that we made up on the spot. There was a small river at the edge of the property, where we would often go to fish or simply watch the water flow by. Those days were filled with adventure and wonder, and I remember them as some of the happiest of my life. Every summer, we would travel to Sweden to visit my father's family. The journey was long, and I always found it exciting to leave the warmth of Spain and arrive in the cool, crisp air of Sweden. My father's family lived in a quaint wooden house by a lake, surrounded by forests that seemed endless to my young eyes. The summers there were magical, long days filled with swimming in the lake, picking berries in the forest, and sitting by the fire as my father's mother told us stories about trolls and fairies from Swedish folklore. It was a world so different from Spain, and I cherished those times we spent there. As I grew older, I began to understand more about the world outside our family. The political situation in Europe was changing, and tensions were rising. My father's business was affected, and the once steady stream of luxury goods began to slow. There were whispers of war, and soon those whispers became a reality. By the time I was in my 20s, the world was engulfed in conflict, and the carefree days of my childhood seemed like a distant memory. But through it all, my family remained strong. The values my parents had instilled in us, hard work, generosity, and love, became the foundation upon which we built our lives. Though the world outside was in turmoil, our bond as a family remained unbroken.